On this edition of the Newsmakers, it's the final stretch in one of the most talked about presidential elections in history. We have a week of special reports from the United States, starting with a look at the media's role in the race. Also on today's program, the Petrodollar princess, Angola's Supreme Court summons President Dos Santos over his decision to give his daughter control of the state oil company. And picture this, a celebration of light over dark. Millions take to the streets to celebrate the Festival of Lights. Hello and welcome to the Newsmakers with me, Andrea Sankey. Now, it's been compared to a mud fight and a dumpster fire, and most voters probably just want it over with at this point. But with just over a week to go until America votes, anything can happen in the race for the White House. The candidates are separated by a hair now in the latest opinion polls, and everyone from Russia to the FBI is accused of trying to influence the result. Now, this week on the Newsmakers, we have a series of special reports from our correspondent, Randolph Nogel. Today, he's having a look at the media's role in this election, and he joins us now live from New Orleans. Randy.
Well, good morning from New Orleans, Andrea. We're about halfway through our U.S. tour, talking to people across the country about this election. And if there's consensus on one thing, it seems to be that this election is not about the issues. A driving force widely seen behind that is the candidacy of Donald Trump, a man who is no stranger to the limelight as a reality TV star and real estate mogul, a man who has acted outside of, some would say, outside of the norm of presidential politics. And Hillary Clinton has spent much of her time hitting back. And while, as you mentioned, some people do see this election as a mud fight, people are tuning in record numbers, something a handful of media giants that control the American media landscape are cashing in on.
Not say that.
It's her 2 minutes.
More than any other U.S. presidential election before it, this one has been a mud fight.
The election is being rigged by corrupt media.
And the U.S. media has presided as judge and jury, weighing in on every rhetorical spar between the two candidates. Networks like CNN pay talking heads, including surrogates for the candidates, to fill the airwaves with nightly squabbles. But critics of the U.S. media's role say it has instigated a character assassination contest.
This is what I call trouble. I'm about to start here.
And equivocated between statements of unequal truths.
They trade barbs. He says she's a bigot, and she points out that he might be appealing to racists.
He said, she said.
And the real challenges Americans face get lost in an abyss of controversy, while ratings soar along with profits for a handful of media giants.
It may not be good for America, but it's damn good for CBS. That's all I got to say. The money's rolling in, and this is, you know, they're not even talking about issues. They're throwing bombs at each other, and I think the advertising reflects that. You know, this is going to be a very good year for us. But, sorry, it's a terrible thing to say, but bring it on, Donald. Go ahead. Keep going.
The political rise of Donald Trump was unexpected. 5 years ago, his political ambitions were a punchline.
Donald Trump has been saying that he will run for president as a Republican, which is surprising since I just assumed he was running as a joke.
Women of America in particular are very concerned.
And while much of the media have criticized his inflammatory remarks,
to replenish the Social Security Trust Fund,
his lewd behavior,
He's going like, I don't remember, oh, maybe.
And his disregard for facts,
President Obama, he is the founder of ISIS. He's the founder of ISIS.
Many people say the media is responsible for his rise. In March, well before the conventions and his nomination as the Republican candidate, Trump trounced all other candidates in the race in terms of free media, to the tune of almost $2 billion.
We're going to be talking about what we can do together, but Donald Trump is taking a very different tone.
I think the media knows that the public thinks he's entertaining, and if they're broadcasting Trump, people are going to watch and get their viewership up.
I think a lot of people find comfort in whatever message they want to find, and they go to that channel.
And I think that's the way that they're going towards, because they want more people. They want to attract more people because more people are kind of more distant from it.
But in the end, it was just one more plan that didn't work.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
In 1976, following a wave of widely lauded journalism from Vietnam to Watergate, 72% of Americans said they had trust and confidence in the mainstream media. 40 years later, that number has hit an all-time low at 32%.
The race for the White House isn't just a choice between two candidates. It's an opportunity to debate and discuss the challenges America faces. But it seems airtime for measured, serious discourse has shrunk, along with competition in the media marketplace.
Just 6 companies now control 96% of U.S. media. And many critics say corporate media giants primarily see their audience as consumers, as opposed to citizens, something which has complicated the concept of a free press as a fourth estate. So if viewership drives content, does tawdry spectacle become paramount to an airing of the issues? Is hyperbole prioritized over perspective, and superlatives over alternatives? Randolph Noble, The Newsmakers in Washington.
Well, joining me now from Washington, D.C. is Daniel McCarthy. He is editor of The American Conservative. And also from Washington is Sam Husseini. He is the director of media and communications at the Institute of Public Accuracy. Thanks both so much for joining us. Now, apparently you both feel that media coverage hasn't been fair in this election, but you seem to differ at who's been left at a disadvantage. So, Daniel McCarthy, I'll start with you. What has the media done wrong? How has it been unfair?
Well, I think the media has simply trivialized the election, and perhaps Sam and I would even agree on some of this. It seems to me that rather than covering the issues, they preferred to cover sort of celebrity kinds of issues. They preferred to cover the candidates' characters in ways that make them sort of figures of fun or figures of controversy, as opposed to spokespersons for serious issues. And it's not just my own view that this has been a problem. A recent Quinnipiac poll, for example, found that 55% of likely voters thought that the media had been biased in favor of Hillary Clinton.
Okay. Sam Husseini?
I do definitely agree that this election largely represents the triumph of celebrity. I think in large part the media painted Clinton as inevitable, pushing aside Sanders and other challengers. But they also, as your lead segment correctly noted, gave immense amounts of free media as well to Trump, sidelining his challengers, including those who might also have tapped into an anti-establishment perspective that the public seems to crave. Rand Paul, for example, and other candidates on the Republican side. So I think that there's been that kind of overwhelming bias and a trivialization of the facts. I certainly agree about that because, I mean, Trump, there's been a homegrown industry of fact-checking Trump, and a friend of mine, Ali Abunimah, coined the term Trump washing, that in effect a large part of the media say, oh, blame him, he's the crazy one. Don't look at us, don't look at the rest of the establishment. When Trump criticizes something like the Iraq War, what do the media rally around? Oh, you're exaggerating or you're lying about that you were against it from the very beginning. Well, maybe so. I think Trump does fabricate a great deal of information, but it sort of lets the rest of the media and the rest of the establishment off the hook in terms of their own fabrications, distortions. Clinton's own record in terms of foreign policy has gotten incredibly little scrutiny.
Okay. But Daniel, I want to go back to something you said. I mean, obviously you think Trump has had a disadvantage because Hillary Clinton has such a relationship with the media. But going back to earlier in the campaign, you know how many people were complaining that Trump was getting billions of dollars in free publicity because he is so entertaining. These media networks see him as a draw. They get the viewers when they put him on. And that publicity came for free.
Well, certainly the media was trying to take advantage of Trump as much as possible. He was fantastic for ratings. That was something they were happy to glom onto and exploit. I don't know that it necessarily had much of an effect, however, on the Republican primaries, for the simple reason that so many Republican primary voters really dislike the media. So simply having Donald Trump covered there and often criticized by the media was something that was perhaps more likely to make Republican voters not vote for Trump simply because they were seeing him, but rather to question the entire process that was going on. It seems to me that Trump actually did have a populist connection with the Republican voters that really shouldn't be underestimated. It was not simply a media concoction, even though the media certainly gave him plenty of attention.
Well, Sam, let me ask you then, is it a problem with the media or a problem with the public? Because the media will often argue when they're criticized for doing poor, cheap coverage of these candidates based on, entertainment, basically, that the public is getting what they want, that they have to cater to ratings, and this is what the public is calling for. Is that a fair argument?
I don't think it's a fair argument. I think the public can and should be criticized in many ways. But look, I've done a fair amount of work on this very particular point. All of the polls that we're hearing about, these so-called public opinion polls, glaring omission. None of them actually ask the public who they want to be president. They all have the structure of, if the election were held today, which of the following would you vote for? And given our system in the United States of elections, where we don't have things like ranked choice voting and so on, it in effect forces people into their partisan boxes. And that's another level of filter that you see against third-party alternatives. You have the media entering into a basic cartel with this bipartisan commission on presidential debates. They create an appetite for change and will build up somebody like Trump, who, from my perspective, is probably a charlatan, and push aside meaningful alternatives at virtually every turn. I think that is the deep structural problem that we're seeing here.
Okay, Daniel, go ahead.
Well, it seems to me that Trump has actually sort of defied that analysis a little bit. That in fact, Trump is a political outsider. He's someone who has shaken up Washington, D.C., someone who certainly has shocked and shaken up the Republican establishment. So even within the system that we have, I think Sam is quite right that there are limitations, there are filters that are placed on things. Yet one of the glories of Donald Trump has been, in fact, that he has smashed these filters and has given voters a genuine choice. I think there is a sharp difference between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, a much sharper difference than there was between Mitt Romney and Barack Obama. And that's a wonderful thing. American voters should have a choice of very stark differences on the Supreme Court, on foreign policy, and on so many other issues.
Okay, well, let me raise this point, as it was brought up in the report we saw from Randolph there. Is it okay to pay these surrogates that have been sitting in the spotlight now in the past months for the purpose strictly of defending a candidate? Eventually, you can't really discern their honest opinions from their goal of just getting their paycheck. Sam, let me start with you. Is it fair to include these surrogates constantly in the media debate?
Probably not, but I think the bigger problem is the way that the media report on the candidates as if their public pronouncements were their actual opinions. They quite frequently are not. I mean, Clinton is claiming that she's against these trade agreements, for example, that the public is quite strongly against. Trump also is saying that he's against them, and I think it's more likely that he is against them, but I wouldn't take that to the bank necessarily either. So I think that there's too little scrutiny. You raise the subject of, are they just being paid for spouting certain opinions? I think that level of scrutiny should be brought to bear on the candidates first and foremost.
Okay, Daniel, have you the same mindset that it doesn't pose a conflict of interest necessarily, that they're paid to have a very particular...
I'm not saying that it doesn't.
Okay. Daniel, go ahead.
Yeah, I think the question does indeed go deeper. So most of the surrogates who are getting paid to go on television and defend one of the candidates or the other, I mean, they do actually sincerely believe what they're saying. The bigger problem, unfortunately, is that you also have people who are being paid to go on TV, former generals and others, to represent various views on foreign policy and on policy issues. I think that actually has a more profoundly distorting effect. When it comes to partisanship, it's very clear who Republicans support and who Democrats support. And these media figures who are paid surrogates, it's not surprising that they would do it even without the money. But on so many other public policy issues, it really is a distortion and perversion of our media system.
I thought Daniel was saying that there was a war in the Republican Party a bit ago, that it's clear who Republicans are supporting, but you were saying that the Republican Party has been totally shaken up here by Trump. So maybe it's not so clear who Republicans
Well, it has
support.
been. The Republican establishment has been shaken up by Trump. So it's not that the Republican Party's base has had that much of a civil war. It's true that Trump has slightly less support, among Republicans in general now that he's the nominee than some of the past nominees have had. But in fact, it's most Republican voters, most grassroots voters are supporting Trump, and I expect come Election Day, even some of the gulf that you see between Trump's numbers right now and those of past nominees will shrink. No, what Trump has done is, in fact, to shake up the connection between the establishment and the grassroots. Basically, Trump has shown that the Republican Party's leadership class had no real support among its voters.
Okay, Sam, if you don't have a reply, I'll just finish with one last question there. I mean, tell us, Sam, what you think the media could actually do then to be fairer to both the candidates and to the public in the election campaigns?
They can start asking the public what they want affirmatively on various issues. They can start giving reasonable treatment to so-called third parties. They can start covering the facts and scrutinizing the policy positions of the candidates. Clinton in the recent WikiLeaks was quoted as saying, you need a public position and you need a private position. That has been evident for some time, and the media do a very poor job of discerning between public and private positions, in effect pulling a boondoggle on virtually every issue upon the American public.
Okay, Daniel, your final thoughts on that?
You know, I agree with much of what Sam says there. It seems to me that the best thing the media can do is to stop covering campaigns and elections as sort of staged professional wrestling matches between, a face and a heel, a good guy and a bad guy. Instead, they should be covering the issues. They should be talking about, for example, foreign policy, the Iraq War, or justices, who's going to replace Antonin Scalia on the court. And they should be talking about these without, framing it always as one candidate versus another, and rather framing it as what the American people actually want to see in terms of policy and how the candidates match up with their differences and how the voters would choose between them.
Okay, Daniel McCarthy and Sam Hussein, we're going to leave it there. Thanks so much both for joining us on the Newsmakers. Still to come on the Newsmakers, the billion-dollar question facing Angola's president over his daughter's role in the state oil company. And in Picture This, Diwali lights up the Indian subcontinent. Angola's president is set to appear before the Supreme Court to explain why he appointed his billionaire daughter, President Dos Santos, head of the country's state-run oil firm Sonangol. Angola is now the continent's largest oil producer, but lower prices have drastically cut the national budget, and that's widened the already deep divide between the ruling elite and ordinary citizens. Natalie Pohonen has more.
Angola is one of Africa's richest sources for oil, but the wealth from black gold hasn't trickled down. It's been carved up to create one of the world's most unequal countries. After decades of civil war and corruption, everyday life is a strain for most people. But it's home to Africa's richest woman, President Dos Santos, nicknamed Princess. Forbes magazine estimates her wealth to be about $3 billion. She's also the eldest child of José Eduardo dos Santos, who has ruled Angola since 1979. Elections are due next year. Whatever the result is, Santos says he'll step down from office in 2018. But before that, he'll have to face the Supreme Court over the appointment of his daughter as head of the state-owned oil company Sonangol. Oil production accounts for 45% of the nation's GDP and more than 95% of its exports. Control over that business is closely linked to power in the country. The sharp decline in international oil prices has drastically hit the national budget. The government is struggling to provide basic services like sanitation and access to healthcare. And ordinary people are struggling to survive, creating an even wider divide between the people, the princess, and the president. Natalie Pohanen, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now is Frank Charnas in Tel Aviv. He is the CEO of Bodhi Intel, a political and economic risk consultancy group specializing in sub-Saharan Africa. Frank, thanks so much for joining us. I want to start by asking you about this case that's been filed by 14 lawyers in Angola against the president, accusing him of nepotism for appointing his daughter as head of Sonangol. First of all, has action like this ever been taken before in Angola? And how far do you think this case will go?
To my knowledge, no action like this has taken place in Angola, and it's hard to tell how far the case will go because Angola is a very strictly run one single party state. Jose Eduardo Dos Santos has a very powerful control over the country, and it's unlikely that he will allow the courts to take this case further than it would go normally or really into an in-depth situation. So
it is pretty remarkable that they've gotten this far, is it not? The fact that it's become international news.
Yes. Yes, Angola is a really tightly run country, and the media is completely controlled by the government, by the ruling party, the MPLA. So it's, firstly, within Angola, very unusual to see any anti-MPLA or anti-Dos Santos message getting out. And secondly, it's even more rare to see any news coming out of Angola into the international spectrum.
And it's also very hard from the outside to get an idea of what Isabel Dos Santos is actually like. She's been written up numerous times in Forbes magazine for being Africa's richest woman. I believe she claims a fortune of about $3 billion. Can you tell us anything about her? Is she, at the very least, a good businesswoman, or is she only the product of privilege?
Well, the jury is out on this. She's very definitely the product of privilege, and it does appear to be that the seed capital for what has become an empire was in fact supplied by the state, in some cases from Sonangol itself. So this would make it very easy for her to then go on to gain prominence as a business person with that backing. On the other hand, she has managed to accumulate $3.3 billion of wealth estimated, and in Africa as a woman, and being the first black and the first African billionaire, female billionaire, this says a lot about her business acumen. So it's very difficult to tell how much of this is Isabella and her capacity as a business person, and how much of this is nepotism and the leg up that she was given from being her father's daughter.
Okay, now her father, Jose Eduardo Dos Santos, has been in power since 1979. He's now indicated that he will step down in 2018, but he has indicated he'll step down before and then never did. The problem is here, there's an election in 2017. Why would he say he's stepping down a year after a free election is supposed to take place?
Well, it's likely that he would win an election, which wouldn't necessarily be free and fair, but he would win that election. And so it would be easier to pass on the leadership and to keep the reins of power within his close circle, probably his family, or to people really closely aligned to him.
Right.
So by announcing that he'll hand over power after the elections, what he does is he makes sure that he has the power and that then he can hand it over to whomever he chooses. And
they're talking about whom he chooses could possibly be Isabel Dos Santos, part of the reason he'd like to give her these positions in government. Are we possibly looking at another Gabon scenario with Omar to Ali Bongo, where there will be some sort of election and it will just be an empire to take power for decades and decades?
Possibly. Gabon's not the only example. There's Togo, there's the DRC, there's Equatorial Guinea. The situation is that for these leaders, the fear of losing power means that they might stand a persecution or a prosecution from the opposition parties, from the international community. Moreover, they could lose access that they have to the wealth of the country. So in many cases, it's the fear of losing power is actually the fear of losing their position and losing their futures. And so they do what they can to maintain a close control over that power.
Okay, Frank Charnas, we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us on the Newsmakers. In today's Picture This, lights are shining on housetops, around temples, and outside doors and windows. Hindus around the world are marking their biggest annual festival, Diwali. Here's a look. You've been watching this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Andrea Sankey. Thanks for joining us. Goodbye.